The Australia Together podcast is brought to you by Australian Community Futures Planning, Australia's first community-based research and planning entity organising to involve Australians in planning a better future for themselves and for future generations. Find out everything about ACFP and how to become involved at www.austcfp.com.au. ACFP acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as First Australians and recognises their culture, history, diversity and their abiding connection with the land. We pay our respects to Elders past, present and emerging and fully acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. The Australia Together podcast is recorded on the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. In February 2023, Australia's Treasurer Jim Chalmers released an essay on the economy called Capitalism After the Crises. A few months before that, he also expressed a desire to have a conversation with the Australian people about how we pay for the services that they need and deserve and have a right to expect. In this essay, ACFP's founder, Bronwyn Kelly, replies to the Treasurer and offers some ideas about how Australians may participate in conversations with the government, not just about how they might pay for the services they deserve, but also how their values might influence the shape of Australia's next economy. This essay is being delivered in 4 parts. In Part 1, Bronwyn discussed Chalmers' commitment to hold conversations on the economy and suggested that Australians should chime in. She outlined 3 priority conversations that should be established between the government and Australians at large if we are to succeed as a nation in building the sort of economy the government wants, one that promotes inclusion, equality, and the values of Australians. The 3 suggested conversations are about a values-based economy, a competitive economy, and a fair economy. In Part 2, Bronwyn discusses how the government can have conversations with the Australian people about a values-based economy.
The neoliberal form of capitalism is one that is poorly regulated, predatory, excessively private sector controlled, exclusive, and it abjures fair competition. Few, if any, progressive economists would disagree that that type of capitalism is the cause of our current economic woes. After all, 40 years of the privatisation and deregulation promoted by neoliberal governments has given us nothing other than a decline in productivity, low wages and growth in all types of inequality, including income, wealth, gender and intergenerational inequality. It's also given us an explosion of private monopolies and attendant problems of market concentration, and a loss of or inaccessibility to services that are essential to what really matters, the well-being of people. Neoliberalism is indeed capitalism bereft of social purpose. This is so obvious that in his essay about capitalism after the crises, Australia's Treasurer Jim Chalmers does not waste time trying to prove yet again the connection between neoliberalism, economic decline, and growth in inequality. Instead, he focuses on the opportunity we have in the 2020s to learn how to do things differently. For Chalmers, doing things differently involves starting with good information about the level of well-being we have now and measuring changes in that over time to determine whether policies are working to improve our quality of life. He is working with Treasury to build a framework for monitoring well-being, which he intends to announce in a Measuring What Matters statement sometime in the middle of 2023. ACFP has made a submission to this project. Links are in the description below. From a podcast interview about his essay, it's clear Chalmers imagines a national wellbeing measurement framework which will build on the OECD's Wellbeing Indicators framework and will contain around 25 indicators of what matters most to Australia and Australians. Presumably, he is anticipating that in the event that trends on these indicators take a turn for the worse, This will provide a good system of guidance for policy adjustments necessary to restore a positive trend of well-being. This is a logical approach to policy making for the public good, but it contains a number of inbuilt limitations. One of those is that because it is essentially backward-looking, it means that we will be locked into reactive, as opposed to proactive, approaches to policy making. This sort of measurement framework forces us to put off the opportunity to optimise policies until such time as things get worse, and so much worse that it has become obvious in headline indicators of decline in well-being, such as massive increases in mental health problems or homelessness. In this arrangement, policy adjustments are always derived from a misery we should not have created in the first place. This is not to say that we should give up on the idea of measuring well-being. On the contrary. But if we confine our approach to securing well-being to one where we do nothing more than gather better data to look back on mistakes, then we will be doing little more than consigning ourselves to an unnecessarily bumpy ride. And the conversations that Australians might have with their governments, assuming each government is willing to have them at all, will always be about the mess we have made and the lottery of who gets to have the next shot at fixing it, assuming anyone can. Chalmers' essay is in fact a demonstration of the limits of this backward-looking approach to measuring well-being. Taking neoliberalism for the colossal mistake that we now know it is, he suggests we should react with what he regards as an opposite approach, which on the surface makes sense as a possible fix. That ostensibly opposite approach is to be manifest by government leadership in renewing and restructuring markets. He says, here the government has a leadership role to play, defining priorities, challenges and missions, not picking winners. This is critical, he says, to guide how we design markets, facilitate flows of capital into priority areas, and ultimately make progress on our collective problems and purpose. The neoliberal model, he says, is the opposite of this. It pretends to be agnostic on these questions, but ultimately a choice is still being made through passive deprioritisation and the perverse outcomes and greater vulnerability that emerge over time. For the moment, we can leave aside any discussion about whether Chalmers is describing opposites here, whether there is much difference between the neoliberal model and a system in which governments facilitate flows of capital into priority areas in partnerships with the private sector. At this point, it's likely to be more useful to dwell instead on Chalmers' suggestion that we should change the decision system so that we use it to shift investment in Australia towards public value. He is committing to introducing a new relationship of collaboration and co-investment between government and the private sector, recognising, as he says, that government, business, philanthropic and investor interests and objectives are increasingly aligned and intertwined. It's noticeable that the interests and objectives of Australian people themselves aren't mentioned here, even though they are supposed to be the centre of it all. But putting that to one side, Chalmers' argument is that values-based capitalism will henceforth be enthusiastically embraced by business and that this will overcome the neoliberal perversion of capitalism, reinstating a market economy that once again works for people. His central assertion, after the teachings of Mariana Mazzucato, is that in capitalism, markets built in partnership through the efforts of business, labour and government are still the best mechanism we have to efficiently and effectively direct resources. This is an expression of faith in markets if they are well regulated and run cooperatively for the benefit of all, not just for some. And it's an avowal that if markets are run as partnerships between business and government, they will be sufficiently inclusive to reliably and efficiently deliver what the community actually values and needs. There are a few issues with this. To begin with, we would need to rely on the good faith of all players, not just in individual markets, but also through time, by which I mean across periods of change in governments and perhaps in periods of relaxation of regulations that require businesses to act consistent with the public interest. In other words, in those periods of market failure that inevitably arise from regulatory failures. In particular, we would need to be assured that private investors who may be the beneficiaries of investment of public funds would shake off their past irresponsibility and forever after honour obligations to provide social returns. Chalmers assumes through his experience in forums such as the Investor Roundtable that there is a will within business toward the public good, that there is what he calls a genuine appetite among so many forward-looking business people and investors for something more aligned with their values and our national goals. This is a rather more benign image of private investors and corporations than we have evidence for. Despite some indications that the corporate world has discovered environment, social and governance principles, known as ESG, and corporate social responsibility, known as CSR, an alignment of business values and national goals is yet to be demonstrated in any reports I've examined, and for the purpose of offering consolidated reports to Australians about their well-being, such as the State of Australia 2020 and the State of Australia 2022, I examined quite a lot. If anything, the evidence suggests that state capture by corporations is now so firmly entrenched that corporate values have eclipsed national goals. An alignment is not in evidence, and certainly not as a national trend. Moreover, public-private partnerships exhibit little, if any, of the ethics and commitment necessary to deserve the name partnership, and certainly not a partnership of equals. This applies notwithstanding the discovery of ESG and CSR by more enlightened businesses. No doubt there are some good souls in the business sector who are looking for investments that are in the public interest. There is doubtless an appetite among investors, for instance, to avoid investing their wealth in businesses exposed to climate risk. But that appetite only arises from the desire to avoid losses rather than from any more altruistic alignment with national goals. Indeed, the desire to avoid climate risk is likely to be more about ensuring businesses have built up sufficient investments to allow them to offset any losses that might arise from the more risky but high return investments businesses will still want to make in fossil fuels. As such, there is little in the market behaviour of capitalism to suggest that businesses will shake off their instinctual greed for the sake of the well-being of nations. Their capacity to resist the temptations of rent-seeking, especially while they maintain limited liability for the invested funds of others, is highly dubious. At least we should view it as dubious, based on the evidence to date. It is a good idea to build a well-being measurement framework, and there should be no doubt about Chalmers' assertion that what we measure directs our action. Australians might also be thankful that at last we have a treasurer who is willing to pursue an agenda that puts human values in the place of business value. But if we want the most useful well-being indicators framework, if we expect that it will guide us towards the policy decisions that actually deliver what we really value, then there are a few gaps that need to be filled in Dr. Chalmers' approach. Any treasurer seeking to build a well-being indicators framework capable of efficiently guiding policy to deliver what Australians value needs to start by asking them what they value. Chalmers has missed this fundamentally important step. Had he taken it, he would have found that Australians value more than the things that would or could be measured by a backward-looking wellbeing indicators framework of the OECD style, and this might have resulted in a different or additional set of strategies, those best suited to creating values-based capitalism. In his zeal to offer hope through leadership, he has assumed he knows enough about what we value to build policies that will reliably deliver it. But it is likely that he has missed at least half of what it is that Australians value, if only because he is focusing on our well-being now to the exclusion of what we might want it to be in the future. Australians highly values some things that, unfortunately, are typically absent in standard wellbeing measurement frameworks like the OECD's. I've documented these values in extensive research in my most recent book, The People's Constitution. Examples include peace, freedom, employment of choice, not just a job as such, and decency in international citizenry. Each of these and several others that are absent in OECD-style measurement frameworks have a major effect on our sense of and our actual well-being. Australians also value a particular future, one in which their children will flourish. This too is not normally articulated in standard measurement wellbeing frameworks like the one Treasury is proposing to build. What this means is that a measurement framework which omits deeper consideration of what we value and doesn't even attempt to articulate it as the primary guiding principle for design of a new economy will not be as useful for purposes of sound policy development as a wider values-based framework would be. It will not be enough just to measure changes in well-being compared to the past on a few high-level indicators, which if the OECD index is anything to go by, will in the main not be about what the Australian people value, and then react by policy amendments when and only when the trends turn badly on those few indicators. What must be measured simultaneously is whether the trends are bending in the right direction toward preferred targets for the future. The measurement framework needs to be forward-looking as well as backward-looking. And unless it contains both those perspectives and is specific about what we value now and for the next generations, any conversation that a treasurer may have with Australians will be fundamentally incapable of establishing something as ambitious as values-based capitalism. Luckily, Australia already has a dual-vision wellbeing measurement framework that can be useful here. It's called the Australia Together National Wellbeing Index. I'll speak more about that later. In the meantime, if Treasury wishes to establish a forward-looking values-based measurement framework, one capable of building a values-based economy, they will need to ask Australians what they want for their future. This is not something governments have been predisposed to do. They're naturally shy of unleashing demands they might not wish to satisfy, and certainly do not wish to be held accountable at the ballot box for failure to meet those demands. The natural preference of our major political parties is to present Australians with a fait accompli about what they can have, rather than ask them whether they want it or not. And what we will be permitted to have, at least in the sort of economy preferred by neoliberals, is always going to be far less than we need. But if we organise ourselves to articulate what we want for our future, we can then construct an indicators framework which will be far more useful in delivering the future we prefer and with less mistakes. With that sort of dual vision framework in hand, we are less likely to waste time and money on policies that are unlikely to take us where we would prefer to go as a nation. For instance, had we had such a dual vision framework in hand, we would certainly have started sooner on cutting carbon emissions, well before we ended up in a place of large-scale societal anxiety about impending climate catastrophe. Had governments attended and acquiesced to the clearly expressed aspirations of Australians, they would not have lumbered them with such inept policies on climate. It's a matter of record in Lowy Institute polls that in the 16 years between 2006 and 2022, the proportion of Australians who wanted the government to do something to prevent climate change never dropped below 80%. As early as 2006, over 90% wanted the issue to be addressed, with approximately 70% of that group wanting something done immediately, even if this involves significant costs. So, while the people of Australia at the start of the 21st century had the foresight to see that it would be in their interest to begin taking steps to stop climate change sooner rather than later, even if this involves significant costs, or at least consider taking steps that are low in cost, successive federal governments failed to establish a plan to prevent or mitigate climate change, and Conservative governments in particular used any argument they could no matter how unfounded, to kill off every chance of the Australian people to rise to the challenge of climate change and protect their economic interest and their children's future. A dual forward and backward-looking wellbeing indicators framework, one which is more specific about what we value both now and for our future, works more efficiently to weed out weaknesses in policy sooner rather than later. And the Chalmers essay gives us some insight into how a merely backward-looking framework is inherently ineffective as an instrument for identifying the best suite of integrated policy solutions, the ones that are likely to be the most cost-effective in the long run. Had he considered a broader array of the values of Australians, it is likely that he would have begun to build more resilient solutions than those posed in his essay. Building reasonably well on the learning of the last decade, he has, albeit belatedly, identified the policy priorities of an orderly energy and climate transition, a more resilient economy less vulnerable to unreliable supply chains, and a focus on adapting to new technology. And he has homed in on collaboration and co-investment with the private sector as, in his view, the best means to deliver public value. But had he looked towards the preferences of Australians for their future, he could have developed a deeper picture of public value, which would have inspired a more robust set of policy options, a set of integrated policies which help us transcend the risk of changes in government. For example, he may have figured out that Australians don't want war, and this may have helped him shape a budget which relies less on building up arms to start one and more on building up social and humanitarian programs to prevent one. It may have helped him withstand pressure from the military-industrial complex and a belligerent America intent on prioritising their national interest above ours, and in the process cruelling our relationship with our biggest trading partner, China. He may also have discerned that an economy and services that are resilient through time and less prone to budgetary pressures or political attack are more likely to arise from a strengthened role for the public sector in delivery of services by active competition with the private sector. Instead of increasing his faith in the benevolence of businesses and a voluntary alignment of their values with national goals, he may have chosen to establish new policies which can strengthen the safety of whatever public investments are made with what is, after all, a very doubtful partner when we attend to the evidence about what the private sector has valued. The private sector values profits, not people. It is likely that Dr. Chalmers is drawn towards relying on the idea that the private sector will respond with alacrity to his invitations to become a more responsible and fair partner, because he is working on the assumption that there are budget constraints for the government in delivering services direct and owning and operating critical infrastructure. He is subscribing to the view that when it comes to what governments can do for us, we are limited by wealth. Apparently, he is not persuaded by modern monetary theory and its claim that governments are not limited by a lack of funds, or at least he's not inclined to being seen as a treasurer willing to maximise the advantage of being a sovereign issuer of currency. Clearly, he has been persuaded, or at least he wants to persuade us, that the $1 trillion of debt his government has inherited constitutes a barrier to direct investment of taxpayer funds in Australians and makes it imperative that he should replace that with investment of those same funds in businesses instead, working on the assumption that businesses will spend that money well. There is no evidence that the private sector spends taxpayers' funds any better than the public sector. There is more evidence to the contrary if price hikes and productivity falls are used as measures. And because Chalmers' disregard of this evidence seems to have confined him to an approach of fiscal rectitude, it has led him to assume he must rule out large public sector projects and government trading enterprises. He asserts that this preference for limiting the public sector as a bigger player in markets is not just a function of a debt-laden budget, but a purposeful choice to change the dynamics of politics towards what he calls a system where Australians and businesses are clear and active participants in shaping a better society. This year, he says, our institutions can draw on all the nation's talents. It is a nice wish for 2023, but to the extent that a preference for balancing a federal budget forces any government to clamp down on spending public funds directly on the public, it does not and cannot establish an economy that draws on all the nation's talents or resources. It does not grow investment in the public good, and therefore it does not build resilience into the economy at all. Moreover, to the extent that it siphons public money to private control, it actually puts the budget into a worse financial condition, especially if the recipients in business do not play the partnership game ethically and responsibly. The Treasurer's policy suggestion does not constitute a system which will draw on all the nation's talents. It will tend more to exclude them and lock them into a position in which their role is always to simply bail out businesses when markets dominated by the private sector fail. Also, it is not a system which will allow the public to share value and returns from delivering services to themselves. On the contrary, it's still neoliberalism. It's still picking winners, and the winners are private corporations, not the public. So in the third part of this essay, I will look at one option for a renewal of capitalism that is less superficial than the makeover offered in the Chalmers essay. This is not to suggest that the makeover should be abandoned, but there is an additional choice that the government can make for reform and restructuring of Australia's economy so that it is restored as a far more competitive one that's resilient through time and actually does fit with what Australians value. Chalmers believes that the system of values-based capitalism he has described is a realistic possibility, probably because he's a politician and a superficial makeover of capitalism is politically pragmatic. It would be considered by his cabinet colleagues as a strategy that is less likely to be derailed by the corporate powers that will inevitably be ranged against it. This is the sort of realism to which politicians are confined. It's merely political realism and should not be mistaken for economic realism. As an economic strategy, it's very unlikely to give Australians a realistic chance of building a form of capitalism that values people, let alone one which restores equality to a point where Australians can once again enjoy a fair share of returns for investment of their public funds. If a people-centred economy is truly valued by the Albanese government, there is an additional strategy that could be considered. This option would add something to Chalmers' optimism that will help the government sidestep the clear weakness of the politically pragmatic approach that relies far too heavily on co-investment with a partner whose values and interests are not those of the nation, and far too little on restoring competition so that business has sufficient incentive to behave well as a responsible partner in meeting national goals. To sum up, an additional lesson the government might learn, if it really wants a values-based economy, is to ask Australians what they value now and for their future. Then, and only then, can the government begin designing an economy that maximises their capacity to deliver the inclusion the government wants and the sort of well-being Australians want. This amounts to a recommendation to the government that cooperation with Australians should come before cooperation with business, if a new form of capitalism is to be built that values Australians. At the same time, if the government wants an economy in which businesses offer what the nation values rather than just pursue profits, then it would be as well to attend to the full depth of evidence of the failure of neoliberalism and look to solutions which offer the public additional capacity to withstand the market failures that arise from it. This will necessitate a tough conversation with business about what it will take to build a competitive economy. Given the power of the corporate sector, this is not a conversation for the faint-hearted. Business will fight back. But if the government approaches the business sector armed with a strong and verified understanding of the values of Australians, the government will be better equipped than it has been to date to stand up for an inclusive economy, which can really bend business towards a values-based form of capitalism by reinstating the competition in the market that has been removed by neoliberalism. In the next instalment of this essay, in reply to Jim Chalmers, I'll discuss why and how this conversation about a competitive economy should be had.
That was the second of 4 parts in this talk in reply to Jim Chalmers. Listeners wishing to know more about the latest research on the values of Australians can read about it in Chapter 5 of Bronwyn's book, The People's Constitution, The Path to Empowerment of Australians in a 21st Century Democracy. And for more information about a comprehensive dual vision, forward and backward-looking wellbeing index that is already available for use by Australians and their governments, visit the Australian Community Futures Planning website at www.austcfp.com.au/national-wellbeing-index. Links to the People's Constitution and the Australian Community Futures Planning website are in the description below. In Part 3, Bronwyn will discuss how the government can have conversations with the Australian people and businesses about the need for restoration of competition in the Australian economy after the ravages of neoliberalism.